Ahmed Shah Masood is the legendary guerrilla warrior known as the Lion of Panjshir. He made his name resisting the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the 1980s. At the time, the Wall Street Journal named him the Afghan who won the Cold War. Today, he is back on the front lines fighting against the Taliban, the Muslim group now controlling much of Afghanistan. Sebastian Junger spent a month following Masood on assignment for the National Geographic Adventure magazine and the National Geographic Explorer. I am pleased to have him on this broadcast to talk about what he saw and what he did and what's going on in Afghanistan, particularly in light of the fact that there have been lots of reports this week over the efforts of the Taliban to destroy all kinds of what they characterize as idolatry, which are symbols and icons and huge statues of Buddha. I'm pleased to have Sebastian Junger back on this program. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Why Afghanistan for you?
Well, I was there in '96, right before the Taliban took over, and I was just struck by the beauty of the place. And it's a country that's in tremendous turmoil, tremendous chaos following the war against the Soviets. It's just a very compelling place to work. And in addition, Ahmed Shah Masood is a legendary figure there, almost mythic, as a defender of Afghanistan. And after I left, he ended up in a pretty big fight with the Taliban, and I wanted to go back and see how he was doing. His Northern Alliance became more and more fractured over the past few years. Right now, he's really holed up in sort of an enclave in the northeast.
And he controls only the mountains, right?
Yes, he controls about 20% of the country, but it's virtually inaccessible by land. We had to go in by helicopter, a Russian military helicopter.
An old one at that.
A very old one. Ironically, the Russians, having fought him for 10 years, now are helping him. They're supplying him because they really fear a Taliban regime on their borders, and for good reason, I think.
And the Taliban is supported by Pakistan?
By Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Otherwise, they're not recognized as a government by any other country in the world.
Why are they doing so well?
Well, I'm not sure doing that well.
Don't they control, if they control 80% of the country, and they've defeated the Taliban, the Taliban have defeated Masood in battle after battle after battle.
Well,
according to you.
Well, they took 80% of the country at a time when the alliance that was formed against them was tremendously disjointed. There was a lot of infighting. The last 20%, they've been trying to take it for years, and they can't.
Even though they have more guns, more people, more soldiers, everything.
Exactly, and more importantly, they receive a tremendous amount of support from Pakistan. And not just support, but there are Pakistani soldiers fighting in Afghanistan alongside the Taliban, tank divisions, commandos, generals supervising things. And I feel that without that involvement by Pakistan, the Taliban really would be forced to negotiate a coalition government with Masood, and the war would end. Pakistan's support really is permitting the war to continue.
Any covert support from the United States to Masood?
No, there's not. Things may change. Up till now, there haven't been. He's supported now by Russia and Iran and India.
Why are they supporting? Because they're opposed to the Taliban?
Well, I have a variety of reasons. The Russians do not want a fundamentalist Islamic regime.
Yeah, but what about the Iranians, who don't have any general fear of fundamentalist regimes?
No, but they have a long-standing rivalry with Pakistan. They don't want Pakistan to control Afghanistan. It's all very complicated geopolitical issues in that area. It's a very complicated area.
But I mean, it would seem to me the Taliban has by virtue of the fact that they have so few people that really recognize them, and they're hiding Osama bin Laden and all these other things that make them a kind of pariah in terms of the rest of the world, that would bring a lot of support to Masood, and I don't understand why it hasn't.
I don't quite either, and frankly, I don't think he understands why he's not getting...
That's his question, too, isn't
it? No, it is. In '94, the Taliban initially received a lot of support from the U.S., partly, I think, for legitimate reasons. It really looked like they might bring peace to a completely fractured country. And partly, there was an oil deal brewing, an oil consortium, including a very large U.S. company, Unocal, wanted to put in a pipeline from Turkmenistan, the oil fields of Central Asia, through Afghanistan to Pakistan and out to the sea. And the Taliban were going to facilitate this, and there was very intensive deal making between Unocal and the Taliban, and the U.S. jumped on board pretty quickly in support of the Taliban. I think they really regretted that, because within a year or so, the Taliban really showed their colors, and I think we're a bit of an embarrassment to the State Department.
Masood, tell me about him. I mean, you call him legendary. There's sort of, the article is called "The Lion of the Winter," I guess.
Yeah, he's absolutely revered. With, I think, 3,000 men, he managed to defend the Panjshir Valley. And the Panjshir Valley is an absolutely critical, strategically critical spot in Afghanistan. The Russians tried to take it 9 times. Massive, massive assaults with 15,000 troops, tanks, artillery, aircraft. They never took that valley. Masood defended it with 3,000 men. They never took it, and eventually the guerrilla war that he was sort of the mastermind of bled them until the Russians finally had to pull out. After 10 years of war, it cost 1 million Afghan lives, but they drove the Soviets out.
Most people know you because of The Perfect Storm, the book, then made into a movie. What is it that turns you on, that makes you want to leave the safety of New York City, if it's safe, to go to Afghanistan and clearly put your life at risk?
This is a complicated question. I'm absolutely intoxicated by journalism. I just love working as a journalist, and a place like Afghanistan is the most intense form of journalism that I've experienced. In a far-off country, very chaotic situation, war zone. I feel like it's sort of, for me, it's the most intense thing I can do, and of course that, whatever, for anyone, that most intense thing, whatever it is a very compelling thing to do. I grew up in a very quiet little suburb, and frankly, I think I've had a lifelong reaction to the kind of security I grew up in, if you want to psychoanalyze me. And finally, it really is, I don't mean to sound saintly, but there really is something very gratifying about writing about a tragic situation. There are 200,000 refugees on Masood's side of the war, hundreds of thousands on the other side, writing about a tragic situation that the world could put an end to. And I have a certain...
By doing what?
Pressuring Pakistan to not involve itself in Afghan affairs, offering to mediate a democratic election in Afghanistan. I mean, I'm not a diplomat, but there are things that can be done.
Explain to us what their problem is with what they call idolatry and Buddhist statutes, so much so that they are destroying priceless works of art.
To the extent that I understand it, they feel that the original teachings of Muhammad, which really have been distorted, but you could even say perverted by some of the contemporary Islamic regimes in the world, he was worried about idols, pre-Islamic idols being worshipped in Mecca. And the Taliban have followed through on that and destroyed these images without any consideration for any other issue, their value as art, as a piece of Afghan history. One of the ironies, one of the terrible ironies, is that Muhammad, I'm not an Islamic scholar, but I've read about it a little bit, and Muhammad's original teachings were incredibly accepting of other religions. I mean, Jesus he thought was one of the great men in the world, one of the great prophets. I would say Islam in its ideal form was probably more accepting of other religions than Christianity, for example. Clearly, the Taliban are not respecting that ideal, and it's terrible.
Why is that?
Well, I think the Islamic world is being
pulled in many directions.
It is, and it's being forced to modernize very, very quickly. The Christian world started to modernize in the 1700s, the 1800s, the Industrial Revolution. The Islamic world is having to catch up, mostly the developing world, is having to catch up in a matter of decades. And I think there is this isn't my idea, this is something I've read, I can't claim credit for this, but I think there is a tendency to sort of cling to the old principles, to the old thundamentals when your society is just convulsing the way it is in a lot of Islamic countries. There also is a certain power in being fanatical, being fundamentalist. It's very easy. Things become very black and white. It's very easy to cast people as a traitor to your country. It gives them a tremendous political power within Afghanistan.
Let's take a look at this film. Roll tape.
السلام عليكم جو
At Masood's local headquarters, crowds of commanders and their troops, civilians and refugees are gathering.
Characterize him for me, because this piece you've written is rather obviously laudatory about him.
Yes, it is.
I mean, it clearly is a sense of this is a man that you admire enormously.
Yes, he is. I'd heard such incredible things about him, and I went over there thinking, okay, don't fall in love with him. You know, as a journalist,
You failed.
Yeah, no, exactly. I was like, try to find something that you don't like about him, or you're just not going to look credible.
Yeah, I know. I kept looking for that, and fair enough. But
I looked, you know, I
mean, if you went looking for it and didn't find it, the honest thing to do is say I didn't find it.
That's exactly the position I was in, you know, and I was. I mean, militarily, I think he's a genius. I mean, just his history with the Soviets, that's pretty clear. What I was amazed by was that he had just an incredible compassion as a person. A real love of poetry. He's a very sort of sweet man. I don't know how else to describe it, but just in his presence, I really felt like this is a really compassionate human being. And it's, I know you don't see that very often in someone who has the military history that he has. His treatment of women in his areas is very, very good. Women don't have to wear veils. They can work. All the problems the Taliban have, he doesn't have them. It's a very open, it seems like a very open society. He loves reading. He wants to, when the war's over, he says, I just want to retire and read my books. You don't hear that very often from generals.
What's going to happen to him?
Oh, I don't know. I'm hoping that he will be able to retake Kabul and force the Taliban to negotiate some kind of coalition government. I think that would be the best. It should not be a Tajik government because, of course, then the Pashtuns will say, okay, now we're being oppressed. It'll go on and on. There needs to be a UN-sponsored election, a coalition government, some kind of UN supervision, or this is just going to go on for another 20 years.
As someone said, it seems like most of the wars these days are not between one nation against another, one nation state against another. Most of the wars these days are within national boundaries.
Yeah, that's right.
In terms of ethnic or other groups fighting each other.
That's right, and inevitably those ethnic groups receive sort of outside sponsors who have their own agenda within the country, and of course the greater powers can keep a war going indefinitely.
And also the old alliances are no longer there as a sort of benchmark. You know, you used to say, well, the Russians are going to be on one side, the United States is going to be on the other side, and they'll support both of them, and, you know, and you don't have that anymore.
No, it's a very confusing, situation.
It's true in the Balkans, and it's true in Afghanistan, and it's true in Africa.
Oh, all over Africa, yeah. That's absolutely right.
Sebastian, it's great to see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. See you next time.